Good evening and welcome to the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution's Business and Economics series. I'm delighted to see you all here. This is a hybrid lecture, so we've got people in the room and we've also got people on Zoom. So welcome. For those people on Zoom, could you please remain on mute and please turn your cameras off until we get to the Q&A session. At which point then please unmute, show your video, and you can ask your questions in 3 different ways. You can just raise your hand in the old honored fashion. You can use the raise your hand facility in Zoom, or you can put things into the chat room, which I'll moderate as soon as Melih starts. So these are all the formalities over and done with. I would like to just let somebody else in while we're waiting. And now I would like to introduce Melih Celik. Dr Melih Celik from the University of Bath. He is the senior lecturer at the School of Management, dealing with logistics. And today, as you can see from the title, the logistics of disaster relief and humanitarian aid. Very, very important. The efficiency and effectiveness of altruism and of charity is of vital importance, and to make sure actually that altruism filters through to the front end as much as possible. So Melih has been here in Bath University for how long? 3 years, and you've taken your doctorate in Georgia Tech in Atlanta, where he met his lovely wife, and so you know, good things happen in academia, which is great. So without further ado, please let me introduce you to Melih Celik.
Thank you, Andreas. I suppose I can remove this now. So welcome everybody in the room and also on Zoom. Very good evening to you all. My warm thanks to the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution for having me over here. It's really a privilege to be able to share my work with you. One thing I should give as a disclaimer is in 45 minutes, I won't be able to give full justice to what really happens on the field. But I will try to do my best. The second disclaimer, I think, is this is from a researcher's window, so I'm not always down in the field. So we may want to keep that in mind. So with that, I'll be talking about the logistics of disaster relief and humanitarian aid. And the way I will go about doing it is I will first start by motivating why we do this. I'll basically start with some grim numbers, really. I'm pretty sure nobody needs motivation for this, but it's good to keep those numbers in mind. It's really a good reminder for me as well. So then I'll go on to defining what disasters and long-term issues are, and because they are the main theme of this talk. I will then talk about humanitarian supply chains, and I will try to compare and contrast them with your typical for-profit supply chains, which I'm pretty sure most of us will be familiar with. And then I'll talk briefly about the challenges we face in humanitarian supply chains, and I'll try to finish by how we can help humanitarian supply chains by research. So without further ado, we need to click this presentation. Andreas has already done this, so I realized that I have this slide with all sorts of redundant information now. So yeah, as Andreas mentioned, I've been a senior lecturer of operational research and supply chain management at the University of Bath, the School of Management. And in case you're not familiar with the term, operational research is the art and science of bringing quantitative research and the power of mathematics, systemic thinking, and interdisciplinary work to aid managerial decision problems. So what I do is mainly number crunching, but I will not show you any equations. I will show you very little numbers, that I promise. But if anybody is interested in the specifics of the number crunching that I do, I would be happy to talk about it, of course. As Andreas mentioned, my PhD is in industrial engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology, which is in Atlanta. So industrial engineering doesn't exist here, which is why I'm in the School of Management. What I'm doing is pretty much still industrial engineering. So I'm an engineer. I work with numbers. I work with quantitative reasoning mostly. I happen to be Turkish, and I have had teaching and research experience in the US, in Turkey, and in the UK, hence the strange accent that you're hearing now. But this also has given me the experience to talk about some of the specifics of these countries when it comes to humanitarian supply chains. And as you might know, Turkey is one of the countries that has been bearing some of the burden of humanitarian supply chains when it comes to refugees. My research focus is on logistics, as again Andreas mentioned. I do quantitative research on logistics and mainly humanitarian logistics in addition to warehouse logistics. I won't be talking about any warehouse logistics. But in general, I like anything that's related to moving things, the flow of goods, commodities, and people, in addition to storing them. So that's me. That's the boring bit. I'll start with some grim numbers, really. I'm pretty sure nobody needs to hear about these, but it's always good to keep these in mind. So why do we need humanitarian action? And why do we need it increasingly so now? And I think that one of the most relevant figures is to take a look at the natural disasters that are happening. This is a graphic of those over the pretty much the last 50 years or so. And in case you're interested, there's an institution in Belgium that takes care of this. It's called MDAT, which is actually very similar to the Turkish word for help, which is imdat. So they do keep track of disasters in a very, very rigorous fashion. They have a very good database, in case you're interested. And this is what the grim figure looks like over the last 50 years or so. These are the number of disasters that are reported. So as you can see, there has been a significant increase over time, although the number seems to have a bit more stable over the last few years. But the increasing trend is there to stay. And I don't know if you could figure this out because the colors are a bit hard to read, but the most common disasters we face are around flood, extreme weather, such as heat waves or cold patches, droughts, extreme temperatures, so on and so forth. Now, when you think to the reasons behind this increase, you can think of many different reasons, actually. So one of the reasons in the increase in numbers is due to, well, it's reported more now. You have social media, you have the internet, people are there to report to you whatever is happening on the corner of their street. So one reason is, yes, there were disasters before that we did not know of. Now we know more of them. But there's also other things like having a more dense population. So disasters have a more profound effect at the moment compared to, say, 50 years ago. There's more economic activity, which means that their economic impact is also increasing. And I think one of the most important ones, as is also proven by this figure, is the climate crisis. People tend to call it climate change, but it is actually a crisis, as you can see here. So floods, extreme weather, drought, they're all results of changes that we've been imposing on the climate ourselves. A few more grim figures, really. So if you check the number of deaths, you will see that over the last 30 years or so, these do change between years quite a bit, depending on what sort of disasters that we're facing. Especially when you have earthquakes or droughts or extreme weather, they tend to go up. So there have been certain years, for example, you can look at 2010, which is the year of the Haiti earthquake, where we had more than 200,000 people dying from it. Or you could take a look at 2002, where you had the Sahel droughts, where you had, again, more than 100,000 people passing away. So number of deaths mainly depend on the type of the disaster. So in a sense, on a bad year, you could have as many as 300,000 people dying from natural disasters. If you look at the number of people affected by them, it's an even more grim number, really. We're talking in the order of hundreds of millions of people, really. Now, the last figure I wanted to show related to disasters is probably the least important of them all. It's the economic damage. While it still does play a quite important role in disrupting our economic activities. So again, depending on the type of disaster, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars lost every year. And these are the direct impacts, really. We cannot measure the indirect impacts of disasters that are happening. When people think about humanitarian aid, humanitarian action, most people tend to think about disasters. But I would also like to draw your attention to more longer-term issues. And I will just show you numbers about refugees, which is only one of those issues. If you look at the refugee numbers over the world, so the numbers you see there are refugee numbers, which means they're internationally displaced people. These are people who have had to go outside their countries for refuge. But if you look at the overall number of people who are displaced from their homes, this includes the internally displaced people as well. We're looking at a total number of 82.4 million people. out of which 26 million are externally displaced refugees. So really grim numbers due to many different reasons. That actually is the main motivation behind why we need humanitarian action and why I do this sort of research. So in the upcoming slides, I will try to first of all define what a disaster or a long-term issue means for me, because it's a very subjective definition really. Why that requires some additional action on top of what we do with for-profit supply chains. So what is the global situation? So what players are there in the global world in terms of responding to these issues? And also what sort of problems do they face on the field? Again, this doesn't give full tribute to what they're actually facing. I'll try to overview them as much as I can. And again, I will try to talk about what sort of research I have been doing with my colleagues to be able to help these situations. And again, that's going to be barely scratching the surface, but again, just to give you a gist of how we could be of help. Okay, so the question about why now? Why now meaning why in the last couple of decades we seemingly started caring about these more than we used to. The reason behind approaching humanitarian supply chains in a similar way as we approach for-profit supply chains, in the sense that we are looking for more coordinated and collaborative action, is pretty much similar to why we need for-profit supply chains, in the sense that, well, information has gone through a big revolution recently, and that has also affected how we look at disasters and humanitarian issues as well. So information gets shared much more quickly. I remember when I first started doing this research, this was about 2010 when the Haiti earthquake happened. This was when Twitter was really taking off, and I remember the excitement around how we can use Twitter to get real-time information from people in very remote parts of the world, even in a poor country like Haiti. So that has given us lots of data and lots of information about what's happening at that moment. There's lots of on-site real-time broadcasting. Now people are their own journalists, right? So you have people, shooting YouTube or TikTok videos from all sorts of places in the world. So everybody's a broadcaster in that sense. And well, this has pretty much led to higher expectations for rapid response and greater demand for being more prepared for these disasters. So one thing people tend to ignore when we think about these is, well, people tend to focus more on response because it's, well, quote unquote, it's sexier. Right? When a disaster does happen, we would like to respond. It attracts more funding from donors as well. But the actually much better value lies with preparedness. So people have started realizing that as well. There's less tolerance for errors due to these reasons. So just like with for-profit supply chains, we change very drastically over time. So we want an agile supply chain, we want an adaptable supply chain when we're producing goods or services. But the same now also goes for humanitarian supply chains as well, because the types of disasters or the humanitarian issues we have been facing also have evolved over time. If you think back to the 2011 earthquake in Japan, we refer to it as an earthquake, but it wasn't really just an earthquake. Right? So we had the earthquake, which was followed by the tsunami, which was followed by the nuclear attack. So actually the sorts of disasters or issues that we have been facing have also have gotten quite complicated with us. So in a sense, our humanitarian supply chains also need to be adaptable and agile, which again is not something that I would think of if I didn't know these supply chains better. And yes, so any inefficiencies, any mistakes are much less tolerated when it comes to humanitarian supply chains. I remember talking to a colleague who does research in this field, and he actually mentioned that this is more like a goalkeeper in a football game, because they are remembered for the goals they concede rather than the ones they save. So when you're actually quite successful in humanitarian response, it doesn't make the news as much as it would if you were unsuccessful. So in a sense, there's more fear, and rightfully so, to be more responsive, better responsive, so that, well, you're known for your better response. The other thing is obviously with the technological changes and also the knowledge around supply chain management, which is carried over to the humanitarian world. Now the interorganizational relationships have gotten better as well. So there's the technology and the willingness available among the players in the field to collaborate together, because through for-profit supply chains, we have seen that we benefit, each of the members of the supply chain benefit from collaborating together. So people have understood the need to not just act by themselves, not to act as a single entity, but rather to come together and act together at the same time. Now, before I go any further with describing logistics and supply chains of humanitarian aid, which is the main topic of this talk, I want to give you my definitions of what requires humanitarian aid or humanitarian supply chain response. And I will divide them into two different groups because I think they constitute a huge difference between each other to deserve separate types of response and preparedness. So the first one is, the first part of my data was related to the disasters. There are many, many different definitions of a disaster, right? So it could be, you could talk about personal disasters and bad things might happen and you can call them disasters, and rightfully so. There are also other definitions of a natural disaster that might differ from one another. If you look at FEMA, for example, the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the US, their definition is solely based on numbers. So you need to have at least 10 people killed or 100 people affected, or it should make the news, or it should stretch the resources of the community. So it's very quantifiable. But I like the definition that the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Unit makes, because it actually touches upon quite a few important concepts here. So the definition of a disaster in their context is, let's say, disruption. It's a serious disruption, but it's not just a disruption itself. It significantly hampers the functioning of a community or a society, and it causes widespread damage. This could be damage to human health, damage to human life, could be damage to the materials around, to the infrastructure. It could be damage to the economy and the environment as well. And I think most importantly, it exceeds the ability of the community itself to act alone. So you require some external help. This makes a lot of sense to me because if you had a traffic accident outside, it would pretty much, it might fit into some of the definitions we make in the beginning, but I think the community itself would be able to take care of that situation without any external help from, say, outside the city of Bath. So in a sense, a disaster encompasses multiple communities getting involved. So in many cases, it would be multiple nations getting involved at the same time. Different people like categorizing disasters in different ways. I'm not a really big fan of this because it's very, very subjective. But I think the most commonly made categorization of disasters is between natural and human inflicted, because it's pretty much the most clear-cut one. Or is it? I mean, when you think of earthquakes, yes, that's a natural disaster caused by the nature itself. But when you think of famines or droughts, I'm not so sure. Many people would claim that they are natural disasters as well, but we as humans have been contributing to the climate crisis, so it's not as clear-cut. By the way, human-inflicted is a more general, neutral way of saying man-made, which used to be the way we term it. There could be sudden onset, slow onset disasters. Again, what is sudden versus slow is in the eye of the beholder as well. But there are clear-cut definitions of, for example, an earthquake being a sudden onset disaster, whereas a famine is a slow onset one. You could have predictable, unpredictable locations and timing. So this is, for example, if you have a set of candidate locations where your disasters might happen, we would generally call this a predictable location type of disaster. So if, for example, when a hurricane is coming into the US, you know pretty much the trajectory of that hurricane a few days in advance. So you have a few days to prepare for it, whereas an earthquake hits you at some time that you really didn't expect it to. So those are the subtle differences. And again, from my perspective as a researcher, they don't mean a lot because it really doesn't affect the preparation and the response all that much, as opposed to, say, looking at something as a disaster versus a longer-term issue. Okay. I think what I would be more interested when I look at disasters is the life cycle of a disaster. That's the figure you see on the right-hand side of the screen there. Pretty much everybody, every entity that deals with disasters in the world has some version of this cycle pretty much well memorized in their heads. And this is one of the first things I learned about disaster management, really. The disaster risk management cycle, as the name implies, it's a cycle, so it doesn't begin anywhere. But from a specific disaster perspective, it starts with the prevention and mitigation side, where the aim is to take a set of actions where you reduce either the probability of the hazard becoming a disaster altogether, or to try to reduce the potential effects of the disaster itself. So there's a very famous saying, which some of you, I'm pretty sure, will be familiar with, is that hazards are unavoidable, but disasters are avoidable. So the idea here is to make sure that that hazard doesn't turn into a disaster. Now, from a supply chain or a logistics perspective, the sort of decisions you would need to make here would be, for example, locating early warning systems. In 2004, in the Indian Ocean tsunami, which affected a very, very big portion of the world and took more than 200,000 lives, the main reason why so many lives were lost was the lack of early warning tsunami systems. So you had people seeing the waves ebbing and then just going out to watch them. Whereas if you had early warning systems, those people wouldn't die. So that would mitigate against the effects of the disaster. Or, for example, retrofitting, strengthening infrastructure components such as bridges. Right? So if you strengthen the bridge, it takes away the probability that, or the possibility that it's going to be damaged by, let's say, an upcoming earthquake. The next stage in the disaster life cycle is the preparedness stage. Compared to mitigation or prevention, here there is some sort of an acceptance that the disaster is going to happen. So the idea is to try to minimize the losses by taking a set of actions where you plan and prepare for that future emergency. So an example for that could be, you might open up some warehouses where you pre-position some relief items. Right? So that doesn't take anything away from the disaster. So that accepts that disaster is going to happen. But at the same time, it prepares for it. Or you could plan the evacuation routes of the people in, let's say, in the city of Bath, just like what Andreas was telling us in case of what would happen if there's a fire, we know where to go. So that is preparedness for a potential disaster. In the next stage, you have disaster response. So this happens after the disaster hits, or maybe while the disaster hits. This is basically what you take from your plans and put into action. So it's the mobilization of your resources, and basically what you're trying to do is achieving timely response to a disaster, achieving efficient and effective response to a disaster, really. So the plans of evacuation that you made before the disaster hit, this is when you're putting them into action. Or the relief items that you put into your warehouses before the disaster hit, this is when you're starting to take them to your beneficiaries. And the last stage, which tends to get overlooked quite a bit, is the rehabilitation and recovery phase. Again, this is mainly because it's not very, very visible. So these are actions you take that have a long-term effect on the society to turn back to some sort of normalcy. Now, the slide also talks about going back to the pre-disaster state. Obviously, that is almost always impossible. But what you're trying to achieve here is to get back to some sort of normalcy that the society can go on sustaining itself as it would before. So some actions that might be of interest here could be, for example, taking your power infrastructure back to its previously operating levels after the disaster. Or it could be completely non-logistics related things like helping people going over the post-disaster trauma. So that would again, although it wouldn't take them back to the pre-disaster stage, it would still try to get some sort of normalcy for them. But it's a cycle, right? So every time you complete this process, it means you're learning new things about the next disaster. And I think that's one of the key things about facing disasters, it's that they're very, very unique events. That is a big challenge in itself. So having, well, no two disasters are really equal to one another. Even if they're equal in terms of their magnitude, their location, their time is different, right? So you will have learned from the previous, well, or maybe you will not have learned, but that makes a huge difference when you face something similar for a second time. So any humanitarian organization in the world is going to try to get itself successfully through this cycle by learning as much and being efficient and effective. So again, the main distinction I would like to make here is between disasters and long-term issues. Although there's no clear-cut difference between the two, I think long-term issues could be categorized in a way where, first of all, well, as the name implies, they take longer times. Think of things like the refugee crises that we're facing all over the world at the moment, or you can think to the world hunger, the food crises that we're facing. So they're mainly there to stay for a long, long period of time, if not for decades. And another difference, a technical difference rather, would be, as opposed to disasters, they may or may not be traced back to a catastrophic event, although they sometimes may be caused by disasters. So some examples include food security, maternal health issues, endemic diseases like malaria, HIV, military conflicts and crises which lead to internal and external displacements, issues with accessing water and sanitation, or chronic infectious diseases, so on and so forth. Again, these are endemic issues throughout the world, mainly faced by the economically underprivileged people. I generally like making this distinction because I think compared to the type of the disaster or compared to the timeline, I think these two make a huge difference in terms of how you would respond or prepare for them. So I would also like to touch upon very briefly about what constitutes a humanitarian action. So given that this is a talk about business and economics, if an entity would like to be in the humanitarian sector, so to speak, what are the principles that they're expected to follow? And as you might expect, they're quite different from what a for-profit organization would follow. The first one, and these are generally widely agreed upon, these are agreed upon by the UN or by NGOs or by other international organizations. So the first one is called humanity. This will enforce you to address any human suffering as you find it. You cannot ignore any human suffering with the expectation that you will see other people suffering later. So you will basically need to fix the problem as you face it. The next one is neutrality, which is actually quite controversial. So neutrality has to do with not choosing any sides when there's a conflict or dispute. There are certain NGOs that put this into question. Doctors Without Borders is one of them, actually. So they will tell you that if there is somebody suffering more than somebody else, it would be better for the NGO to be their voice. But some organizations would not agree with that. But still, again, a vast majority would try to hang by the neutrality principle. Impartiality, which is very similar to neutrality, has to do with when providing aid, focusing solely on the basis of need, so not being partial because of other reasons. The last thing is independence. Many different NGOs or aid organizations have their own objectives of survival mainly, but the objectives in humanitarian aid would need to be independent from any political, economic, military, or any sort of other objective. Some people like adding a fifth one, which is accountability, which has to do with answering back to people in terms of what they have done. Okay, I would also like to take a look in the humanitarian sector a little bit. So what does the humanitarian aid world, humanitarian aid world look like throughout the globe? And I think that the figures are quite small here, but I'll try to let you go through these. So on the left-hand side, you see, just like as you would see in a regular supply chain, the flow of cash, if you will. So when we're mapping a supply chain in general, we take a look at the flow of goods, the flow of cash, the flow of information. So this is what the flow of cash looks like globally speaking. And you will see two different types of arrows there. The blue arrows have to do with flows that we have data on, whereas gray arrows are ones that we have very little information about. And that actually is one of the issues that we face when we are trying to manage these supply chains. So you start with the donors. These donors could be governments, governmental organizations. For example, in the US, you have USAID or PEPFAR, or they could be private entities, or they could be foundations, like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or you have the Clinton Health Initiative, and so on and so forth. But you start with the donors, and the donations could be in different forms. They don't have to be cash. They could be in terms of many different entities, really. But then these would then pass on to international NGOs. They could be UN pooled funds, such as the Children's Fund. You have UN agencies. You have the International Red Cross and Red Crescent. You have the National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, so on and so forth. We have a pretty good information about where the donations go directly. But what happens afterwards is a bit more blurry for us. And that's mainly due to many different reasons, really. One of them being, we don't have the information technology, because as cash goes downstream in the supply chain, the visibility gets less and less, because we're not talking about a supply chain where we're facing an end customer, which is probably something that you can visualize quite easily. We're looking at distant parts of the world where there's no technology to really record these things. We're also talking about things like corruption. So when sometimes the cash will enter a country and you will not hear the end, you will not hear what happened in the end, and they will be used for all sorts of ridiculous things, really. But all in all, I think the main takeaway from here is that as you go downstream in the chain, the visibility of cash, in addition to the visibility of materials or the visibility of information, will also disappear. On the right-hand side, you see a chart of the main players in the humanitarian sector, and I apologize for the fact that they're absolutely minuscule. But again, I'll try to read through those. If you're familiar with Pareto charts, you will know that the first few entities in your chart will constitute a big chunk of what is being shared. The same is true for humanitarian organizations as well. So on the x-axis there, on the horizontal axis, you see the humanitarian agencies, and on the y-axis you see the cumulative percent of funding that has been received. The biggest player in the game, if you will, is the World Food Programme, which is a UN organization. World Food Programme does much more than just providing food to people, which is one of the reasons why it is funded so much more than the others. Then up next you have UNHCR. This is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And again, looking at the size of the issue, that is not a surprise. Although the next dot there says UNHCR, that should be UNICEF. This is not my figure, I have to say. That should be UNICEF, and again, that's one of the biggest players. And they're all UN-based entities. The fourth biggest entity there is the international, it's ICRC, which is the International Committee of Red Crescent and Red Cross. And then you have other UN agencies, the UNRWA, which is also a refugee agency, really. So this is very hard to memorize, but it's the United Nations Relief and Work Agency for Palestine workers in the Near East. It is separate from UNHCR. It's locally focused, but it does deal with more than 5 million people, so it is one of the biggest players there. And as you go up the graph, you will see some brown entities there. Those are the international NGOs, the biggest of them being Save the Children. Then you have others like the Norwegian and Danish refugee councils, Oxfam, CARE, Médecins Sans Frontières, and so on. So it's a big pie, really, being shared by many different entities. And the numbers we're talking about here are in the order of $30 to $40 billion every year of donations. Again, donations in different forms, not all cash. And again, I apologize for the other invisibility of the figure you're seeing there, but again, I'll try to discuss the numbers a little bit more. So here what we have is, on the top left side, you see the total amount of money that goes into humanitarian response. I think it ends at 2019 because the 2020 figures haven't been released yet. But again, we were somewhere around $30 billion US being involved. Where do these come from? They mainly come from, well, the biggest country that is involved is the US, and then you have Germany, UK, EU, and so on. Interestingly enough, Turkey is there with the highest number. That's the grayed out figure there. It's mainly because Turkey reports its numbers in a very bizarre way. So Turkey hosts about 4.5 million Syrian refugees, but they will report the numbers that pertain, well, that are related to all the expenditures that are related to the Syrian refugees, which inflates the numbers quite a bit. So that's why it's there, although it seems to be the biggest player. If the other numbers are calculated in the same way, it wouldn't be. Where do the aids go? Well, at the moment, the main recipient is Yemen because of the issues being faced there. Then you have Syria, Iraq, South Sudan, and Palestine. One of the things that, one important, let's say, a treaty that was made in 2016 was the Great Bargain, which was made in Istanbul, Turkey, and which had some targets about the donations. So one target was to try to offer as much direct funding to the end recipients as possible, so to the local and national actors. And at the moment, the number seems to be somewhere around 2%. So only 2% of the donations that come from the donors directly go to the local or national agencies. It does make a bit of sense because of the logistics involved, but it is still a very, very grim number. And also, another issue here is earmarked funding. So donors, some donors will prefer their funding to go to certain places. So the idea here with the grand bargain is to try to reduce it as much as possible, because this takes away the flexibility from the players that are in the field. Right now, the number has decreased to about 14%, I believe, and it was up around 20% about 5 years ago. So we're actually doing worse and worse in that regard, which is not nice to see. Okay, so what does a humanitarian supply chain look like? That we haven't really discussed so far. And we talked about humanitarian aid a lot, humanitarian response a lot. The importance of logistics is, well, it's something that cannot be ignored. I think when we discussed the topic of this talk with Andreas, the idea was to talk about really the business of humanitarian action. But I kind of wanted to throw this a little bit towards the logistics side of things. A, because I like logistics in general, but B, well, most of the main bulk of performance of humanitarian supply chains comes from humanitarian action comes from supply chain and logistics management. It is widely accepted by logisticians and non-logisticians that about 80% of all humanitarian logistics action and all humanitarian action and humanitarian performance is through logistics and supply chain management, which is why I decided to put the focus here, and which is why if you look at the NGOs or the international players involved, they will put their focus on there as well. Now, obviously, if you wanted to describe a for-profit supply chain, the description would be rather straightforward, right? So you have different entities going from upstream to downstream, materials flowing in one direction. Well, now we have returns flowing in the other as well, but the bulk of the materials will go from upstream to downstream. You have the cash flowing in the opposite direction, and you have information flowing in both ways. Again, I know I have oversimplified this, but it is pretty much common to all for-profit supply chains. A humanitarian supply chain might look differently depending on what sort of issue you're looking at. So if I were looking at a relief supply chain sort of humanitarian issue, a longer-term humanitarian issue, you would have a more established humanitarian supply chain. So this could be, the figure you see there, it could be the supply chain of the World Food Programme helping any country. Let's say the country that receives the most help from the World Food Programme is, I think at the moment, it's Ethiopia. So this could be, for example, the supply chain that aims to reach Ethiopia. And it starts with the donations there, or the supply there. So this is the supply in your supply chain, which are the donations, the prepositioned supplies, or the procured supplies. So the supply doesn't come from one source. It also doesn't come from one means. It does come from different ways. So you have in-kind donations. This could be cash. This could be volunteers. This could be vehicles. It could be donations that are absolutely irrelevant to what you want to do, but it is there for you to use. You have prepositioned supplies. So if you're looking at disasters or crises, especially happening in these countries, we have warehouses. WFP has 6 big warehouses all throughout the world. They're called United Nations Humanitarian Response Depots. So the supplies might be coming from there. It might take months to come in, really. Or you could have supplies. These could be local or global. So local supplies would be within the country, or global ones would be coming from elsewhere. They would, if you were looking at a landlocked country like Ethiopia, the supplies would be coming into the port of entry. The port of entry wouldn't even be in Ethiopia because it's landlocked. Most of them would be coming through Djibouti or through Kenya, through the Mombasa port, which is the biggest port in Africa. Right? Once they hit the port of entry, well, you would be facing lots of taxes, tariffs, and stuff. Would wait there quite a bit of time, and then they would go into the central warehouse, which generally, in the case of Ethiopia, this would be in Addis Ababa. And in many countries, this would be in the biggest city, really. And then it would go into, well, the local distribution centers. So the World Food Program would be calling them the tertiary hubs. It could be somewhere called Dire Dawa, which is right next to South Sudan, hosting South Sudanese refugees there. And that's where you start losing sight of things, really. So at the very end of this, we have what we call the last mile distribution. This is a term that we have borrowed from for-profit supply chains as well. But the last mile distribution in humanitarian supply chains is absolutely different. So we're not talking about your Amazon trucks traveling to you. We're talking about camels. We're talking about people traveling on foot, taking sometimes days to get to somewhere. And again, you have absolutely no idea where your last mile deliveries are. So it's a completely different picture when you look at it compared to a for-profit supply chain. But if you were looking at, for example, a disaster response, you would be facing a very different supply chain, right? So it would start with, say, the government level or the state or the federal level in the case of the US, where you would have maybe different distribution centers or warehouses located in different parts of the country. And then you would have, you might have some evacuation centers, because especially if you're looking at disasters like hurricanes or earthquakes, what will happen is, in addition to the goods flowing from downstream to upstream, you will have people using the same channels to go from downstream to upstream in the opposite direction. So it actually complicates things quite a bit. So in a sense, looking at a disaster versus looking at a long-term issue matters a lot in determining the type of supply chain you're looking at. There are many, many supply chain issues that both of these supply chains face, really, and I won't have the time to touch upon either one of them, which is why I said I won't be able to do justice to the people in the field. These are issues that people have been facing, and these issues might mean the loss of lives, or huge economic impacts, or ineffective response. So what happens on the supply side? Well, you have most supplies are procured in the aftermath, especially when you look at disasters. And this is because it's very, very hard to attract donations from your donors until something really happens. So you cannot say, Haiti is an earthquake-prone country. I would like to store some supplies there in case something happens in the future. It's very hard to attract funding that way. But when an earthquake happens in Haiti, well, you will attract lots of funding, actually lots of donations, more than you would like, really. There's lots of uncertainty. You have a lot of competition, and you would not believe this, but think of two UN entities. I worked with the World Food Program about 8 years ago. So the World Food Program versus UNICEF, both entities trying to provide food to people in need, but there is a competition. They try to be better than the other, which means that they will compete for donations, which means they might get in each other's way, which means they might have the same supply chain you see on this figure twice duplicated by the same, by the UN. So that was the case at the time. So there's very low visibility. There's earmark funds, which I touched upon. So the case in point I have for this is the Haiti case. So what happened with Haiti was you had nothing in the country, no government at all, by the way. And then you had the earthquake happening, which was devastating. And then you had people just sending in whatever they want. Yes, it makes you believe in humanity, but at the same time, it clogs up your supply chain. You had the ports clogged with donations, which may or may not have been necessary. You don't have any drivers, you don't have anybody to carry them, but you have lots of different donations. And then you go into the network that goes until the last mile delivery. Then you might have a disrupted network. Right? If it's a disaster, roads will be damaged, or the warehouses will be damaged. You won't have enough transportation equipment. If you're looking at Africa, or if you're looking at tropical regions of the world, we're looking at wet and dry seasons. would change the picture drastically. So if you're the World Food Programme, you will have to schedule your deliveries in the dry season because, say, when November hits, you won't be able to put any trucks there either. Another issue is security. Again, you'll probably hear lots of UN members getting killed because, again, they're trying to help people who are opposing the people who killed them. So the network itself is also quite challenging. Again, a case in point here is the Typhoon Haiyan, where the road damage made sure, well, it ensured that if you were in the airport, which is right outside the city, I think it was about 6 miles away, you would need to take about 8 hours to just being able to get to the city because of the damage in the roads. Or you had the issues in Hurricane Maria, which was in Puerto Rico a few years ago, where you had the aid trapped in thousands of containers at the ports because there were no drivers to take them into the island. So at the last mile, I already talked about this. At the last mile, this is like trying to really pull up a spring. As you go farther and farther, it becomes much harder to reach the end. So there are lots of last mile difficulties, and disasters or these long-term issues are unique events. So you don't know what the demand is going to be like because you didn't have an event like this before. You can only have an estimate, an aggregate estimate of things. And one question people tend to ask you, and I remember asking this to my students and getting really interesting answers. So who is the customer in this chain? Well, when you think of the downstream end of things, well, you think of the beneficiaries who are in need of things, yes, but at the same time, another customer lies in the opposite end of the supply chain, which is your donors, because you're responsible to them. So they will ask of you. I mean, you are accountable to them, which sounds a bit cruel, but it is the case. You have to answer to them, and not all of them will be in line with what you're trying to do. So again, many different issues. I remember giving weeks and weeks of lectures about these, so I feel a bit of an injustice trying to describe them in 10 minutes. So a case in point is actually about the Tigray crisis that's ongoing. So there's one main road that goes into the region, and when it's blocked, you basically have to find other means. So that's an issue that they're currently facing at the moment. Okay, so I'll breeze through the remaining challenges because, well, I'm running out of time anyway. But measuring performance in a humanitarian supply chain is another issue. When you're looking at a for-profit supply chain, the main performance measurements are more or less straightforward, right? You're trying to get the maximum profit possible, or you're trying to, get the minimum cost possible, so on and so forth. I mean, there will be an agreement on the performance measures, whereas with a humanitarian supply chain, we're looking to, seek minimization of loss of life and alleviating human suffering. But also you're trying to mitigate the needs and trying to provide sustainable reduction of disasters, also vulnerability, but these are all conflicting objectives. So different people, different stakeholders in this, like donors, NGOs, governments, private vendors, they all have a different stake in this. Well, beneficiaries also have a different stake as well. So multiple stakeholders have multiple conflicting objectives, which makes it much harder to manage this. And also the legitimate question is, well, how do you measure loss of life? Or, well, that's more or less straightforward, you might think, but there's a difference between somebody with a certain age dying versus somebody else with a different age dying. So people tend to measure these things in different ways. Or how do you measure suffering? How can you measure suffering really, or vulnerability of people? One important concept here, and I'm going to just leave this here, I teach almost a whole class on this, but is the concept of equity. And because of this, people think I do banking research, by the way, because we have to use the word equity. But there's the idea of equity where you try to serve people in an as equitable way as possible. The question is, what is equitable? It is very context dependent. So there's a huge amount of research that goes into it, which starts from philosophy, really. So it starts from Aristoteles, who had the first idea about equality, which is being refuted all the time now, but it is still there. So how do you define an equitable supply chain? That is a question that we try to answer from time to time. There's politics. We talked about being impartial, being neutral, but you're in a political environment. You cannot really always avoid this. So a positive example is during the Bosnian refugee crisis. I'm slightly old enough to remember what was happening there, but what happened, well, I didn't know this, of course. But what UNHCR did, the High Commissioner for Refugees, actually at some point suspended all activities and withdrew their stuff. And the main reason was Well, because the roads were not safe enough. The lives of staff and beneficiaries were endangered. So the commissioner actually accused the political leaders of not ensuring safe passage. So the response to that was that the commissioner was being selfish, but it actually pushed the negotiations to be resumed, and a safe passage was provided. And actually, there was a formal thank you from the Bosnian vice president at the end. So seemingly non-humanitarian action might end up with humanitarian results, or the opposite might happen. So 2002 famine in sub-Saharan Africa, where 5 million tons of food were needed in, I think this was in Zambia, which I forgot to put the country name, but WFP worked it quite well out. So, and this is this is among high prevalences of HIV, lots of economic crises, and limited access to the country. Timely response was received, and the food was there. But then, well, the president, basically just rejected the aids because it was genetically modified. And what he said was, just because our people are hungry, it doesn't mean we will feed them poison. Again, when I discuss this with my students, there's always a very useful, fruitful discussion that comes out of this, because we will generally, the classroom will be completely divided in two, and then there will be harsh discussions about it. I mean, there's some truth to it. You cannot expect people to, yes, we say beggars are not choosers, but this, we're talking about humans here, humans with dignity here. So sometimes seemingly humanitarian actions might end up with non-humanitarian results. So politics is always there, you cannot always avoid it. The last challenge I will talk about is the coordination. So there are successful implementations of coordination, the UN cluster approach being one of them. So what UN does is it sets its entities responsible for different things. For example, WFP is responsible for the logistics as well as food security, WHO is responsible for health, UNICEF is responsible for nutrition, which, by the way, had a lot of, is a result of a lot of conflicts with the World Food Programme, which wanted a piece of this pie. But in general, so if there's any response to a humanitarian issue, at least they know who's going to do what in the field. There's also a coordinating entity called HUCHA, which is the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. So it's a successful implementation in that regard. We can also learn from the private sector. So obviously, supply chain ideas can be delivered. Well, many of the supply chain ideas in the humanitarian sector have been delivered from for-profit chains. I don't know if anybody has heard of the Waffle House. I know my wife has, because we lived in Atlanta for quite some time. So this is a chain of restaurants in the southeast of the US. And well, if you're on a long road trip at 6 a.m. in the morning, you're yearning for something, some breakfast, this is generally where you go, because they make good waffles. But they're also known for something else. They never close. Waffle houses are 24/7 open. They never close even when a disaster strikes. Well, they strive not to close. So they're known for their resilience. And for example, so Hurricane Michael was coming, I think this is 2018. When Hurricane Michael was coming, people were looking at the Waffle House to see if they were closing. Because if the Waffle Houses close, it's a serious matter. That means it's a serious hurricane. And believe it or not, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the US, has something called the Waffle House Index, which is the number of waffle houses that are closing or operating in limited menus when a disaster is coming. So they were using this implicitly without letting anybody know. They actually made this explicit now. Actually, you can take a look at the FEMA website and see it now. So we can learn from them. And supply chain resilience is not limited to for-profit supply chains. So again, there are many different examples about this as well. And I'm running short of time, but again, I'll very quickly talk about the disaster management in the United States. This, I think, has become a norm for many other countries in the world as well. So as we know, the US has a dual system where you have the federal system at the top and the states in the bottom. So you have 50 different states down there. So FEMA is the general coordinating entity. It was founded in 1979, was moved to be a part of the Department of Homeland Security, which was formed after 9/11. It does provide national guidance. It coordinates all the activities of the local communities. They do have a federal response and assistance plan, but the main the main responsibility of responding to disasters or humanitarian issues lies with the local governments, the state governments in the US. So as long as well, if there's any escalation, then goes to FEMA. It's similar in the UK with different names and lots of abbreviations. So this is my nightmare slide, which is why I put the legend of abbreviations. But you do have, well, the UK does have a locally decentralized system, which is coordinated by the Civil Contingencies Act, which came along around 2004 and has been updated quite a few times since then. Again, this is mainly inspired by the 9/11 events in 2001. Okay, I'll very briefly also talk about the research, the type of research that I do, just briefly introduce you to it to see what sort of things we as quantitative researchers do in this field. I won't go into the details of this, but hopefully some of these could be interesting. If they are interesting to you, you could ask questions about them later. So I've done quite a bit of research on post-disaster debris management. So one question you ask after disasters is, what do you do with all that rubble? And it's actually harmful both in the short term and the long term. So in the short term, well, they're blocking the roads and they're blocking your search and rescue, your relief distribution, so you need to get rid of them. But the longer they stay on the ground, the more threats they pose to the human health and environment. So we did develop some decision support tools for mainly the US Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA for them to implement when such disasters happen. Another one that I'm actually working with a graduate student of mine is this reinforcement and recovery of interdependent infrastructure networks, which I find fascinating because when we think of infrastructure networks, we think of them by themselves. But if you think of, say, a water network, it's actually powered by the electricity network. Or if you think of the wastewater network, it is not only powered by the electricity network, but also gets the water from the water network. So there's a bit of interdependency between them, and actually recovering those networks has to take that into account. I'm looking, with a PhD student, I'm looking at truck-drone tandems. So this has become quite useful, especially in places like Africa, where you have security issues or wet seasons, where you use not only trucks, but now you can use drones to deliver certain sorts of aid. Not all of them, obviously, but it helps with getting over some of the hurdles that you might face. I'll breeze through these because I know it's been quite some time. I think this is my favorite project at the moment. We're working with 3 Syrian NGOs where they're trying to come up with a plan for their beneficiary appointments. Now, the refugee crisis in Syria has become endemic. We don't have a hope that it's going to go away anytime soon. And what the NGOs are doing is not to try to overcome that, but rather to at least keep the beneficiaries in a stable, sustainable condition. So you have many beneficiaries wanting to receive many different relief aid commodities. So you have many different towns around you, and they need to come, we need to serve them. So what we have been doing is we have developed a simple decision support tool, which uses a complicated model in the background, but also it determines a very efficient schedule for the NGOs. So that's, before I finish up, and I know I'm a bit over time, but I would like to give you the main takeaways. I know I've talked about quite a few bits and pieces of things. So what would you need to take home today? Or if you're already on Zoom, what would you have as your shower thoughts? So what would be the takeaways then? I think, to me, what I have learned from all those years of research, or at least observing humanitarian supply chains, is there are complicated systems and simple rules of thumb that seem to work with for-profit commercial supply chains generally don't work. But the issue is, compared to for-profit supply chains, the stakeholders, the people involved in these supply chains, generally don't have the technical infrastructure or the knowledge or the background to be able to operate complicated solutions. The best approaches, though, they take into account the uniqueness of the situation. There's generally not a one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to these issues. As part of research, this is a growing field of research. Actually, when I started, you would see about maybe 20, 30 papers coming out every year. Now it's in the order of thousands. But a vast majority of these works are still theoretical, which I totally respect, but they're far from implementable. And the best practice I have seen in my limited amount of experience is the collaboration with practitioners, where you talk to the NGOs, talk to the players in the field, and developing easy-to-use tools. Even if you might have a very complicated model, you put it on a very simple Excel tool. With the click of a button, they should be able to get what they want, because A, they don't have the technology, B, they don't have the knowledge to operate all those complicated models. So if you were sleeping through this, which I would completely be okay with. These would be main takeaways for me. So without further ado, I would like to conclude this, and I'm sorry for being over time, but happy to answer any questions.
That's great. Melih, thank you very much indeed for a very fascinating talk. You can just budge in slightly. That's been excellent and really described the complexity to do with humanitarian and relief, disaster relief. I assume that the slides, which were excellent, also were quite detailed. Do you want a copy of the slides? Would that be helpful? Because I think you'll be able to be. So if you have booked on Eventbrite for this evening, then I can automatically send it to you. If not, if you would leave your email address at the front desk downstairs, then I can send it to you as well. Because I think they were excellent. I think they were really excellent, and it really gave a holistic picture, from across the whole of the supply chain in terms of why it's so crucial to be effective in this. Now you've stunned the Zoomsters because there's not many questions left so far. So I'm sure they will come in. I can see a few coming in. But perhaps we start in the room. Would you like to start asking any questions? Right. Lady first. Ladies always first. Lady at the back.
I was really interested in what you said about neutrality.
Yes.
Given that many disasters are facilitated by the military, whether it is local or international, what special challenges does that bring? Is there some NGOs out there that won't because we have to work with any military?
That's a tough question, really. Okay, so there are NGOs. Well, again, Doctors Without Borders being one of them, that don't prioritize neutrality over others because they have their own their own views of trying to help the most vulnerable people. So in a sense, they have faced, for example, many Doctors Without Borders have faced jail time, right? They have been expelled. So that does happen from time to time. So I would say that's one of the challenges. I'm not sure of any other specific examples, but when you're not neutral, obviously you will scare some cats. So that's what I would say is the main problem. So,
thank you. I thought that was terrific, and I loved your slides. It was very, very informative to an area I didn't know about. I've got about 1 billion questions, but I might ask one or two of Andrea's later. You said in your takeaway that it was about responding to the uniqueness of the challenge. Can you give any insight into how that happens practically? As a supply chain guy, presumably you love the fact that there is information feeding back all the time. Presumably it's not like that.
Okay, so I will say things that might sound like cliche. So I have done research in this field for quite some time, but I don't publish tons of papers. And that's because I'm quite selective about them. And the way I select this is, when I see research happening, the research opportunity, I think the main question I ask myself is, how close can I be to the field? So if I count, it's going to be some mathematical set of equations sitting somewhere. Yes, it could be a very good paper that might give me promotion or whatever, but it wouldn't be half as satisfying as being able to have a program sitting on somebody's computer that they would click the buttons and make their decisions. So I would say be as close to the field as possible, which is easier said than done. Have good connections, which is easier said than done. Have good connections on the field. So the Syrian NGO work, for example, we're not allowed to talk to the NGOs. There's one connection there who takes care of that for us because they want to stay completely anonymous. But having a good connection there, at least, it doesn't put you close to the field, but it does give you access to it. So I would say same thing for the supply chain managers as well. I mean, try to be as close to the field as possible, and if you cannot, know people who are close to the field. Again, I know that sounds very, very cliche, but it's the way it is. Yeah.
Thank you.
Let me just talk to the people on Zoom, because we have only got Melih on the screen at the moment, and that's because if you want to ask a question, if you could unmute and show your screen, then we'll be able to see you in the room as well. In the absence, because I know Duncan has already got his hand up, So if you unmute and show the screen, we might actually, and show the video. There we go. Duncan, do you have a question?
Yes, my question is already on chat. And that is, what is the impact of disasters on prevailing military conflicts? I'll just give you an example. For example, during, I think, a Russian and Prussian war, there were so many wolves eating the food and eating the dead bodies that the two sides had to make peace in order to shoot all the wolves. So it's an example of a disaster completely negating the conflictual aims. Do you think this will happen over global warming?
So maybe you might need to repeat the question for the audience.
So the question, I think, is, well, in a nutshell, is, are there any examples of disasters that have alleviated the military conflicts? Yeah. Yes, obviously. I think one example that I haven't witnessed could be the Spanish flu in the First World War, but that's way in the past. I'm Turkish, and we have had our rows with the Greek for quite some time. But one of the things that have bettered the relationship, if you will, is that in August 1999 there was a big earthquake in Turkey, which took about 18,000 lives, and a few months later there was a big earthquake in Greece, which took quite a few lives as well and affected so many people. So what ended up happening was you had Greek NGOs or Greek search and rescue workers coming into Turkey, and then the same happening a few months afterwards. And then the relationships did get much better after that. Because a couple of years prior to that, there were quite a few issues around the Aegean Islands. They were all but forgotten. So that's one example that I can remember. I have seen many other cases the other way around, military conflicts making disasters worse. But I suppose disasters making military conflicts better is an exception rather than the norm, if you will.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, we've got a question from John B. Not one size fits all, but is there scope for an auditable standard with ideal ranges of processes, e.g. expenditure over the process, a dashboard of proposed measures, etc.?
Yes, there is. There's obviously one size fits all is an overstatement in that regard. I mean, there are certain principles that we try to follow when I do my research and when humanitarian supply chain managers manage their supply chains. That would be another talk in itself, to be honest, and I would like to give that one. There's quite a lot to talk about it. I mean, there are obviously quite a lot of do's and don'ts, but again, the thing there is, I think that not one size fits all, but the do's and don'ts would still have to be very general. So understand the specifics of the situation. So if for example, you're facing a sudden onset disaster, do this and that. So that sort of thing. I don't think I would make a general statement and say, locate your warehouses in locations that are, let's say, closest to your beneficiaries or closest to your suppliers. Those sorts of things wouldn't work, whereas they might be useful in for-profit supply chain settings, if that makes sense.
Okay. We've got another one here on Zoom. How important is the effectiveness of humanitarian aid, especially when it is linked to action on the ground?
Well, it's the bread and butter of action on the ground, really. All humanitarian action runs on humanitarian aid. I mean, these NGOs or international organizations don't generate any money in any other way. So all the input comes in from the donations, really. So maybe that's something I could have touched upon better. But these institutions don't sell anything. They don't provide any other services. So all they run is donation money or donation commodities or volunteers spending their time with them. So it's their bread and butter, really.
And are there any sort of charitable organizations that are closer to the ground? So, for example, the Red Crescent, the Red Cross, Médecins Sans Frontières.
Yeah. I think that you pretty much hit the nail on the head, right? So Doctors Without Borders, definitely, because all they care about is being as close to the ground as possible. They would, for example, be okay to get rid of neutrality if that lets them to do so. There are organizations that have been complained to be farther away from the field. UN has been criticized for doing so over the last years. So organizations like Oxfam, for example, for specific sorts of responses, they have been very close to the ground. So there are many, many good examples in that regard. I think there's the trade-off between being centralized like the UN, so being institutionalized and being better planned, versus being decentralized like Oxfam or Save the Children or Médecins Sans Frontières, and being very flexible on the ground.
Thank you. Our Zoomsters are a little bit shy. Only Duncan is showing his screen, and therefore we're not seeing them. So if you want to ask a question, feel free to unmute and show your video, people on Zoom. But in the meantime, we'll go back to the room and ask another question.
Yeah, I went to a course in Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine on humanitarian assistance about 20 odd years ago. The message that came out to me very clearly was that the major factors that caused humanitarian disasters or exacerbated them or prevented them from being dealt with were micro-political issues about competition between NGOs, and it's very clear that that it was a highly competitive market, and that the most popular part of the course was how to apply for a grant, which I thought was a rather sad comment. And the other thing was the macroeconomics of government and political interference. And we spent a whole day looking at starvation. And historically, there's not a single episode of starvation which was caused by a shortage of food. They were all caused by political interference. And in the latter part of the 20th century, starvation was used as a political tool, first of all in Biafra. I think it was Biafra in Nigeria in the early 60s, but was increasingly used in the Eastern Africa as a tool of manipulating political responses. And I'm sorry to sound so negative, but
it is the fact. I mean, it is absolutely a fact. It's something that we tend not to discuss, obviously. But I think the question there is... Yes, sorry, the comment is rather many issues like starvation, for example, have been caused by political stripes, political issues. And okay, I think I forgot the beginning of the comment, sorry about this. Basically, what we are trying to do here is, it might be exacerbating that problem, if I'm putting it in the right way. So I think that bears yes, that is absolutely correct. I mean, some organizations, especially UN-based organizations, have been accused of being too lenient on world leaders, for example, in pushing their agenda, or being too lenient to them in terms of leaving them what to do. And these people have starved quite a few people. I think the question there is, should that stop us from doing the things, or how should we change the way we operate in humanitarian supply chains so that we can avoid those? It's a very difficult question, though. My brother is a political scientist, and he also looks at the political side of humanitarianism, and we have these discussions from time to time, and it's an endless discussion, to be honest. He's more on the critical side of things. I'm more on the optimistic side of things, to be honest. I mean, we do not elect those leaders, so it's very tough to get around them. So we should still find ways. I mean, at least I take the UN approach in that we should find ways around, ways to deal and to sit on the same table with them. And I think to me, as a researcher, that's the best we can do, really. But it's a very deep issue.
The other thing that I remember was the World Bank had a very baleful influence. You haven't mentioned it, the World Bank.
That is correct.
But it was really a sort of almost a tool of Western capitalism to enforce particular roles on developing countries.
Yes, and actually the world
was slightly irritating to China and Russia.
So another example you could give is CARE, which was mainly founded after the Second World War. So CARE is a US-based organization which was mainly founded to push the Marshall Plan. So now it's not doing so. So it started with ill intention, if you will, non-humanitarian intention in that regard. But it is doing, it has moved away from it. So there is hope. I tend to be on the hopeful side when it comes to these things. I know if things go south, yeah, I will be jobless. So I'll try to stay on the hopeful side. But yeah, but it's very fair that to say that not all humanitarian action or seemingly humanitarian action is can be colored in pink.
There's no more questions in the chat room, so any more questions in the room? One more question.
Sorry, I'm going to move you hopefully now into sort of nuts and bolts of logistics and improving technology and everything. I mean, I guess, sadly, I would imagine a lot of the technology development in getting stuff to difficult places to support people has been in the military sphere, getting stuff into the interior of Iraq and Afghanistan. And I don't have any specific insight into that, but I read the sort of general press about people scanning barcodes and being able to put the right part for the right helicopter. Goodness knows how many thousands of kilometers within that. Is any of that filtering into helping the aid supply chain?
Oh yes. Obviously, military has the mobility to do those things, to go into areas where other people cannot, and also they have.
I meant specifically the technology, like the scanners the soldiers have.
Yes, well, yes. I mean, most of that does get into the humanitarian field after a while. So I worked with, during my PhD, we worked with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Mm-hmm. They were extremely knowledgeable about the humanitarian side of things. They were extremely willing to use their technology for humanitarian operations. The tools we built on debris management went straight into their software. So yes, they take their tools and take them into the humanitarian sphere, and also they will work with the people in the humanitarian sphere to help that field as well. So yes, I mean, you can color military in different ways in that regard. I mean, obviously, military doing humanitarian work might go both ways, again, because the military is not a neutral organization. So, but there are goods and bads of it. And I was, to the extent that I saw them, I was happy to work with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
And they were happy with the technology transfer?
Yes, I mean, to a certain extent. Again, we don't know what sort of technology they have completely. But to the extent that we work with them, they were quite happy to share it with us.
Okay, well, I think that's it. I'm looking at the Zoomsters. They're still hidden from view and no more questions in the chat room. Well, this remains for me to thank you, Melih, very, very much for an excellent presentation.
Thank you very much.
Lots of information, excellent slides, which we're going to distribute. So please put your hands together on Zoom and in the room. Thank Melih for an excellent presentation.
So if you get your hands on the slides, my email is at the end. So anything you would like to ask, I will always be happy to talk. If you have a billion questions, I will try my best to answer all of them. So I'd be very happy.
So I think you heard it all. Melih has given me carte blanche authority to hand over his email address for you to comment on the slides. Can you just move into the... Yeah, so it only remains for me to talk a little bit about next month, and that really is a talk on the 14th of December. Again, it's a hybrid talk like tonight, and it's by Dr. Stefan Halscher from University of Bath, and he's going to talk to us about justice in the gig economy. So he's going to be talking about Uber, he's going to talk about Deliveroo, taxi drivers, deliverers, etc., in terms of what it actually means to have an equitable relationship between the employers and the employees. So in the meantime, as I always end on these evenings, stay safe, stay healthy, and most importantly, stay sane. I shall see you next month. All the very best.